What if I told you there's a beautiful commander that turns your creatures into mana and rewards you with a massive amount of card advantage for doing so? Kasla, the Broken Halo. For 6 mana in Jeskai colors, we get a 5/4 angel ally with both flying, vigilance and haste, which in itself is already a very solid stat line. But Kasla isn't just a big evasive threat. She is built entirely around one specific mechanic, Convoke. Now if you are unfamiliar with Convoke, it is a mechanic that allows your creatures to help you cast your spells. Every creature you tap while casting a Convoke spell will either pay for 1 generic mana or 1 mana of that creature's colors. And Kasla actually has Convoke herself, which means that even though she technically costs 6 mana, in practice we will usually be able to cast her for like 1, 2 or 3 mana, simply by tapping our creatures to pay for the rest of the cost. And her Convoke ability also makes Kasla really resilient to any sort of commander attacks, because even if she gets removed a couple of times, for as long as you have a board filled with creatures, you will be able to convoke her back on the battlefield by just using all of your creatures to pay for any sort of additional costs. Now on top of being a really big and evasive body, Kasla also is a value engine that rewards us whenever we play any sort of spell with the Convoke mechanic. Whenever we cast any other spell with Convoke, we get to scry 2 and then we get to draw a card. And while that ability might sound fairly simple, the fact that we get to scry before we draw makes this incredibly powerful. It allows us to filter our draws, dig really deep into our deck, and to consistently find the pieces we need to just keep chaining Convoke spells together. In other words, Kasla will turn any Convoke spell we cast into card selection and card advantage, making her into a massive draw engine just sitting there in our command zone. Now obviously this deck is built around some of the best Convoke spells we have available to us in Jeskai colors, allowing us to repeatedly trigger Kasla's ability and generate us a huge amount of value over the course of the game. But of course, to really take advantage of the Convoke ability, we do need a ton of creatures on the battlefield. And that's where the second half of this deck comes in. Jeskai colors are incredibly good at generating you a bunch of really small creature tokens, which will synergize perfectly with our Convoke strategy, because the more bodies we have on the field, the easier it will become to cast our big Convoke spells for barely any mana, which will then give us a Kasla trigger, which will draw us more cards, helping us find even more Convoke spells, and before you realize, this deck will start snowballing into an incredible value machine. And I mean, just look at the art on this card. Kasla easily is one of the most beautiful magic cards out there. And it's always nice when a commander that looks this good also enables a really fun and a really powerful strategy. Now this list is built on roughly a €250 budget. But throughout the video I will be pointing out some budget alternatives that will push the price down even further and make the deck more accessible. As I do in all my videos, I will be going over every single card in the deck and explaining why I decided to include it. This video is divided up into 6 categories: the token generation, the card draw, support, the win conditions, protection and interaction, and the lands. And let's start by talking about the most important part of this deck, the token generation. All of these cards will provide us with a steady stream of tokens that will help us establish our board and push towards a win, and more importantly act as the fuel to cast both Kasla and all of our Convoke spells. Inox Strike Leader. Whenever you either attack with this creature or your commander, you get to generate a tapped and attacking 1/1 red goblin token for each opponent. Now just the fact that you get a 2-drop body that will generate you 3 creature tokens every single turn is already some really sick value, because all of those tokens entering will trigger our impact tremors effects to push us towards a game win, and if your opponents aren't able to block those creature tokens for any reason whatsoever, they will stick to the battlefield and they will act as great Convoke fuel. And in this specific deck, it is really easy to keep this creature out of harm's way. You can just Convoke out your Kasla. Since she has both haste and flying, you will be swinging with her every single turn, and you will be triggering your Inox Strike Leader, generating you goblins without ever having to get into combat with it. And on top of that, this creature also has an activated ability. On instant speed, you can sacrifice it to give any creature token you control indestructible until the end of turn, which is just the perfect protection tool for the big biggest nightmare of this deck, board wipes. This card is hands down one of the best new additions we got for any sort of token deck. Ajani, Nakatl Pariah, a 2-drop creature that will enter the battlefield with a 2/1 cat friend. Now paying 2 mana for 2 creature bodies is already a really good deal, because it will both enable you to get your Kasla out a couple of turns earlier or to just start convoking really early in the game. And whenever Ajani sees his cat token friend dying, you get to flip him into his backside, which is a planeswalker that comes in with 3 starting loyalty. Now the first ability will put a +1/+1 counter on each cat we control, and honestly it isn't all that relevant in this deck because we're not playing any other cats. The real banger on this card is its 0 ability, which will first create us a 2/1 cat warrior token, and then if we do control a red permanent other than Ajani, we get to ping damage equal to the amount of creatures we control to any target. You can both use this ability as a really solid spot removal tool, and my favorite part is the fact that you can actually win games with this effect, because whenever you are playing this deck, it isn't all that unlikely that you will control between like 10 to 20 creatures. You can then just activate your Ajani, ping 20 damage to an opponent's face, and usually this will be enough to just take them out of the game, making Ajani into one of the best cards in the entire deck. Since the front side is really good in the early game to just get some tokens on the board, and if you do manage to flip it, it will act as some sort of a win condition. Jacked Rabbit, a 2-drop creature with the Ravenous mechanic, meaning whenever you cast it, you can pay any amount of additional generic mana, and it will enter the battlefield with that many additional +1/+1 counters on itself. And if X is 5 or more, you also get to draw a card. Whenever this creature attacks, we get to generate X 1/1 rabbit tokens, X being Jacked Rabbit's power. And thanks to the Ravenous mechanic, this card is both great early in the game and later in the game, because early in the game you can just cast it for like 3 or 4 mana and make it into a solid token generator to establish your board state, or later in the game you can for example invest 8 mana into it and it will be a massive body that will generate you an army of rabbits whenever you attack with it. And if your opponents aren't able to answer your huge Jacked Rabbit, it will just take over the game all by itself. And a really nice thing about the rabbit tokens is that they even enter the battlefield untapped, meaning you can just attack with your rabbit, and in your second main phase you will have a huge amount of bunnies available you can use to fuel any of your convoke spells. Third Pet Iconoclast. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this card will generate you a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact token. By far one of the most potent token generators in this entire deck. And since we are playing about a total of 40 non-creature spells, this is one of the most potent token generators in the entire deck. You can just drop it on turn 2, start playing the deck like you normally would, and if it does stick to the battlefield for a couple of turns, it will generate you a huge amount of creature tokens, which can be used as convoke fuel and will give you a massive amount of damage triggers out of any of our win condition cards. Raise the Alarm. For 2 mana on instant speed, we get to generate 2 1/1 soldier tokens. Now while this card isn't anything fancy, it is really strong in this deck. It will give you 2 creature bodies as early as turn 2 and will enable you to convoke Kasla out on turn 4. It will trigger other token generators like your Third Pet Iconoclast, and the fact that you can cast a spell on instant speed makes it even better, because you can just pass the turn with a couple of your lands untapped, making sure you still have the resources available to cast an instant speed removal or counter spell, and if your opponents aren't playing any threats, you can just play a Raise the Alarm during their turn, and you will get to start your turn with 2 additional creature bodies, making it really flexible. Frontline Rush. For 2 mana on instant speed, you get to pick 1 out of 2 options. The first option is exactly the same effect as a Raise the Alarm, generating us 2 creature tokens on instant speed, and the second effect will give any creature on the battlefield a +X stat boost, X being the amount of creatures we control. Now as you can imagine, with all of the tokens tokens we'll be generating, this card will be able to give like a +10, +15 power boost. And if you combine it with the fact that we have a 5 base power flying haste commander, you can use this combat trick to just buff up your Kasla, and you will easily be able to get to that 21 commander damage and just take an opponent out of the game with her. And it's also a really cool card to use on your jacked rabbit, buff it up to like 20 power, and whenever you now swing with him, you will get an army of bunnies. Secure the Wastes. For 1 white mana plus X, we get to generate X11 white warrior tokens on instant speed. And a spell like this adapts perfectly to whatever stage of the game you're in. You can cast it early in the game to just get a couple of creature tokens out and get a convoke chain going, and later in the game you can just cast it for a massive amount of mana to get a huge amount of creatures on the board, which will trigger all of our damage effects, and you will be able to swing at your opponents on a later turn. Horn of Valhalla and Isgard's Skull. And let's start by talking about the adventure part of this card. For 2 white mana plus X, you get to generate X11 soldier tokens. Now while it is a little less efficient than a Secure the Wastes, after you cast a spell and you generated your tokens, you will get to exile this card, and you will be able to cast the equipment part from exile on any later turn, which will give the equipped creature a +1/+1 stat boost for every creature you control. And just like I talked about with a frontline rush, with the amount of creatures who will controlling, you just have to equip this to your Kasla and you will be able to deal a huge amount of commander damage, or you can even equip this to your jacked rabbit and generate an army of bunnies, making this card both a great token generator and also making it a win condition for us. Champions from Beyond. A card that, just like the previous card, for 2 white mana plus X will generate us X11 colorless tokens. And after it generated its tokens, it will stay on the battlefield as an enchantment, which will give you additional effects whenever you attack with a certain amount of creatures. Whenever you attack with 4 or more creatures, you will get exactly the same effect as Kasla's trigger. You get to scry 2 and then you get to draw a card, giving you some excellent card advantage. And whenever you attack with 8 or more creatures, all attacking creatures you control will get a massive +4/+4 stat boost. And in this deck, this card is just insane, because let's say you have Kasla and 9 other creature tokens on the battlefield. Whenever you now swing, your board will get a total +40/+40 stat boost, which usually will be more than enough to take at least one opponent out of the game with. Cosmogrant Zenith. Whenever you cast your second spell in a turn, you get to pick one out of 2 options. The first option will generate you 2 1/1 human soldier tokens, and the second option will allow you to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Now 95% of the time you will be picking the token generating option, because it will trigger all our synergies in this deck and we will get more fuel to convoke with. In this deck we don't really care about buffing up our creatures, but I suppose in some situations where you already have like 15 tokens on the battlefield that you can already swing with, the counter stacking can be something quite nice. Thanks to us being a convoke deck, it will be really easy to cast 2 spells during our turn, because usually we will just be hard casting a spell and then using our creatures to just convoke out a second spell. And since we're also playing a ton of interaction and spells we can cast on instant speed, it isn't all that unlikely that we are able to cast 2 spells during an opponent's turn, which will give us even more value out of Cosmogrant Zenith per turn cycle. Monastery Mentor, the buffed up version of a 3rd pet iconoclast. Since instead of just generating us 1/1 colorless token whenever we cast a non-creature spell, this time it will generate us 1/1 monk tokens with prowess. Aside from being an excellent token generator due to all of the non-creature spells we are gonna be casting in this deck, it is also a card that can totally take over the game all by itself. Because if it does stick to the battlefield and you are able to generate 5 of these prowess tokens, you can just set up for a really explosive convoke turn where you will be casting like 4 or 5 non-creature spells. Monastery Mentor and all of your monk tokens will get a ton of prowess triggers and you will be able to deal a huge amount of damage with them. Another card card in the deck that your opponents either have to deal with immediately or they will just lose the game to it eventually. Endless Foot Assault, a really unique new enchantment we got in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle set, and it functions in a really similar way as an Inox Strike leader. Whenever we attack, we get to generate a tapped and attacking 1/1 black ninja token for each opponent. And since we will be swinging every single turn with our Kasla, this card will generate us 3 new tokens, 3 triggers on our impact tremor effects, and if the tokens do survive combat, we get 3 more bodies to convoke with. Now while this card might seem pretty basic, the thing that makes this card go absolutely nuts is the fact that it also has the squat mechanic, meaning whenever you cast a spell you can pay 2 mana any amount of times, and every time you do so this card will enter with an additional copy of itself. So later in the game, whenever you do have the mana available, now instead of just generating you 3 tokens whenever you attack, you will get to generate 6 tokens, 9 tokens, 12 tokens, 15 tokens, and this thing gets absolutely out of control. Either converting all of those ninja tokens into a ton of pressure thanks to the win conditions you will see later in this video, and these ninjas will also just deal a huge amount of damage by themselves. All in all, it is an awesome new card I really want to test out. Alright, now let's get into the best card in the entire deck. Invasion of Segovia. It's a 3 mana battle that whenever it enters a battlefield will generate you 2 1/1 Kraken tokens with trample, which will already enable you to cast Kasla as early as turn 4 by just using the Kraken tokens to convoke her. And this makes for some perfect sequencing, because your Kasla will then come down on turn 4, and thanks to both her haste and her flying, your opponents won't be able to block her. You can then swing her at your own battle, and you will instantly be able to flip it into its backside as early as turn 4, which is just absolutely nuts. The backside being a 3/3 legendary creature that will give every non-creature spell you cast Convoke. Yeah, this effect is just broken in this deck, because it will turn this deck into some sort of a Convoke storm deck. You can just have your Kasla on the battlefield, then you can use your creatures to convoke out or raise the alarm. You will get a Kasla trigger, get to manipulate the top cards of your library, draw cards. The creature tokens will then enter, and you will then instantly be able to tap them to pay for the cost of the next non-creature spell you want to convoke out, which in return will draw you a new card of Kasla, and you will just be able to keep chaining a ton of non-creature spells and drawing you a gazillion cards in the process. And obviously this effect is also fantastic with any sort of X spell, because you will be able to tap all of your creatures to pay for the cost for a huge Secure the Wastes, or to get a gazillion hero tokens into play with your champions from beyond. And on top of that totally game-breaking ability, this card also has another effect. At the beginning of your end step, you get to untap up to 4 target creatures, which will enable you to just have more creatures available to convoke out even more non-creature spells during your opponent's turns. Saint Raft and Carolus, a 3 mana creature that whenever it gets tapped will generate you a token. The first time it gets tapped, it will generate you a 1/1 red human. The second time it will generate you a 1/1 blue spirit with flying, and the third time it will generate you a 4/4 white flying angel. And this card will trigger whenever it gets tapped for any reason whatsoever. So it will trigger whenever we attack with it, and also whenever we do tap it to help pay for a convoke spell, which is exactly where his last ability kicks in. Whenever we cast any spell with the convoke mechanic, we get to untap this card, both allowing us to use it multiple times in a single turn to tap and untap it to help pay for our convoke spells, while also generating us a small army of creature tokens in the process. The perfect card to help set up those explosive convoke turns I was talking about. Wildfire Awakener, which funnily enough is the first card with the actual convoke mechanic in this deck I'm gonna be talking about. For 3 mana plus X, you get a 3/2 creature that whenever it enters the battlefield will generate you X 1/1 red elemental tokens. And these tokens also have a passive effect. Whenever this creature becomes tapped, it will deal 1 damage to target opponent. Now obviously these specific elementals are the best convoke fuel out there, because let's say you do have 4 of these tokens on the battlefield. Whenever you now cast a convoke spell and you use these creature tokens, you will be able to chunk your opponents for 4 damage. And this over again turns turn after turn, without even taking into effect that we will be able to untap our own creatures and get multiple uses out of them. Whenever you aren't even using these elementals to convoke your spells and you just swing with them, they will still trigger their ability because you will have to tap them to attack with them, dealing 1 damage per elemental you swing with even before going to the combat damage step, making a Wildfire Awakener one of the best cards to cast either in the mid game to just get like 3, 4, 5 of these elemental tokens and start dealing damage with your convokes, or later in the game whenever you are able to convoke this out for a huge amount of mana and get like 10 or 15 of these elemental tokens. Trust me, it will be really easy for you to just close out the game. Kaikar, Wind's Fury, another classic Jeskai token commander that, just like a third-party Iconoclast or a Monastery Mentor, will generate us a 1/1 Flying Spirit token whenever we cast a non-creature spell, giving us a ton of flying bodies we can start pressuring our opponents with, or just more fuel for the Convoke machine, baby. Kaikar also allows us to sacrifice any spirit we control to add 1 red mana to our mana pool, sort of enabling us to turn our spirit tokens into mana even for spells without the Convoke mechanic. Sram's Expertise. For 4 mana you get to generate 3 1/1 colorless servo tokens, and whenever this spell does resolve you also get to cast a card from your hand with mana value 3 or less for free. While this card might seem really simple on paper, in practice it does give you a really huge tempo swing. Thanks to the creature bodies it generates, it does set up for some really explosive future turns, and the fact that you just get to cheat into play a free Monastery Mentor, a third-party Iconoclast, a Cosmogrand Zenith, or any of the other value engines you will see later in this video gives you some absolutely ridiculous value for just 4 mana. Elspeth Storm Slayer, a massive 5 mana planeswalker with a passive ability. Whenever any amount of tokens would be created under your control, you get to generate twice as many instead. Now let me just give you a couple of examples of how insane this card really is. You will get double the amount of bunnies from your Jacked Rabbit, double the amount of monks of your Monastery Mentor, double the damage dealing elementals from your Wildfire Awakener, double the spirits from your Kaikar, and double the tapped and attacking ninjas from your Endless Foot Assault. Yeah, token doubling effects are just busted in a deck like this one. Now the reason I chose Elspeth as our token doubler over something like an Anointed Procession or a Mondrak is the fact that all 3 of her abilities are really good in this deck. Her +1 ability will generate us 2 1/1 White Soldier tokens, which will add on even further to our board presence and give us more Convoke fuel. Her 0 ability will put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control and give them flying until our next turn, which is a nice way to just buff up the army of tokens we have on the board, but mainly to give them evasion and make sure we can get a huge hit of damage through. And our last ability will allow us to deal with any problematic creatures our opponents control with mana value 3 or greater. An excellent way to deal with a big problematic commander. Now thanks to Elspeth being this good of a card, it also has quite a hefty price tag. And if you do want a more budget friendly alternative, you can also include a Rebel Rousing, which is a 5 mana enchantment that will also produce you a huge amount of tokens, and thanks to the hideaway mechanic it might even cheat some of your bigger permanents into play for free. And the last card in this section is Dollmaker's Shop and Porcelain Gallery, and let's start by talking about the left side of this card. Whenever 1 or more non-toy creatures we control would attack a player, we get to create a 1/1 white toy token. Pretty decent effect that will usually generate us at least 1 token whenever we attack with Kasla, or will generate us 3 tokens whenever we do have 1 creature swinging at each opponent. And whenever this is on the battlefield and we do invest 6 mana, we can unlock the other side of this enchantment, which will change the base power and toughness of all of our creatures to be equal to the amount of creatures we control. And since this entire deck relies on having as many 1/1 creature tokens on the battlefield as possible, this effect is just a really brutal win condition. Because now instead of having 10 1/1 creatures on the battlefield, you will now have 10 creatures on the battlefield. So instead of being able to swing for 10 damage, you will be able to swing for 100 damage. And in most cases, this will even buff up Kasla's base power and you will be able to start taking opponents out on commander damage. If you like these in-depth deck tech videos and you want to support me and the channel, check out the YouTube membership program. Members will get early access to the deck lists, exclusive Discord chat rooms where I'm always sharing what projects I'm currently working on weeks before the videos even go live, and of course that glorious Panzer helmet next to your name on YouTube. And speaking of support, I have some really cool news to share with you. I just became an official Dragon Shield affiliate, which honestly still feels a little surreal to say out loud. When I started this channel talking about my Necrobloom deck in my bedroom, I never expected that one day I would become an affiliate partner of my personal favorite sleeve brand. So a massive thanks to everyone who is watching the videos and supporting me. This opportunity only exists because of you and I will never take that for granted. So if you ever need sleeves or any other accessories from the Dragon Shield website, you can now use the code Panzer in capital letters to get 5% off your order. It gives you a nice little discount and it helps me keep on the lights in the studio. Next up we have the card draw section. While Kasla already acts as a fantastic draw engine in the command zone, these are the cards that will keep our hand filled, dig deeper into our deck, and make sure we also have more convoke spells available to keep the engine running. Skull Clamp, a 1 mana equipment we can equip for 1 mana that will give the equipped creature +1 power and -1 toughness. And whenever the equipped creature would die, we get to draw 2 cards. Yeah, we're a token deck. Obviously we are running a Skull Clamp. The value is just too good. This card essentially reads: pay 1 generic mana, sacrifice 1 1/1 token you control, and you will get to draw 2 cards. And you can keep using this effect over and over again. And obviously in this deck with cards like a Third Path Iconoclast, a Cosmogrand Zenith, and a Monastery Mentor, we will always have the token fodder available to sacrifice to our Skull Clamp. And it's also a really nice way to flip your Ajani into his Planeswalker side by equipping this to his cat friend. Party Treasure. At the beginning of your first main phase, you get the option to discard a card. When you do, you get to exile the top 2 cards of your library and you get to pick one of those cards you get to play until the end of turn. Now in itself, this is already a really potent effect, because later in the game, whenever you already have a board filled with tokens, you can just discard any of your token generators, or whenever you draw into any lands and you don't need those anymore, you can use this effect to discard them and just dig a little deeper into your deck. Like I said, a really neat effect, but where this card becomes absolutely ridiculous is his first passive ability. Any non-creature spell you cast from exile will get the Convoke mechanic, synergizing perfectly with his first ability that will allow you to pick a card and cast it straight from exile, which you can now use your creatures to reduce the cost of. And even whenever you exile something like a simple mana rock with this card, it will gain the Convoke mechanic and you will be able to get a Kasla trigger whenever you cast it. Staff of the Storyteller, a 2 mana artifact that whenever it enters the battlefield will generate you a 1/1 spirit token, giving you some Convoke fuel and a trigger of its next effect. Whenever you create any creature token, you get to put a story counter on this artifact. And for 1 white mana, removing a story counter and tapping this artifact, you get to draw a card. Now with the amount of creature tokens we'll be generating in this deck, I can guarantee you will never run out of story counters, making this card function in a really similar way as an Idol of Oblivion, just guaranteeing you that you can draw 1 additional card per turn cycle. Caretaker's Talent, a 3 mana class card that whenever a token enters the battlefield under your control will draw you a card. This effect will only trigger once per turn. Now we will be generating tokens really consistently every single one of our turns, and this card will give you at least 1 additional card per turn. But whenever you are able to use an instant speed spell during an opponent's turn like Erase the Alarm, you can even sort of bypass the once per turn mechanic and make it draw you more cards per turn cycle. By investing 1 mana, you can make this class go to its 2nd level, which will allow you to create a token copy of any token you control, which I suppose is a pretty nice way to get some additional board presence and trigger its first card draw effect. And the last stage you can make it go to for an additional 4 mana will give all creature tokens you control a passive +2/+2 stat boost, which in this deck will essentially triple all your creatures' power since we will only be controlling 1/1 creature tokens. So suddenly, instead of being able to swing for 10 damage with your tokens, you will now be able to swing for 30, making this card act as both a great draw engine and a fantastic way to actually close out the game with. Enduring Innocence, a 3-mana enchantment creature with a really similar effect as the previous card. Whenever any creature with power 2 or less enters a battlefield under our control, we get to draw a card. Now, since most of our tokens only have 1 power, it will be really easy to trigger this effect, and it will generate us a consistent stream of card draw. And just like all of the cards in the Duskmourn Enduring cycle, whenever this creature would die, it just returns to the battlefield as an enchantment, essentially forcing your opponents to use 2 removal spells to permanently get rid of this card. Benny Brax, a 4-mana creature with the Convoke mechanic that at the beginning of each end step will check if a token entered the battlefield under your control. If it did, you get to draw a card, making it function in exactly the same way as the previous 2 cards, but this time you will also get a Kasla trigger when you cast it due to Benny having the Convoke mechanic. Meeting of Minds, a 4-mana instant speed Convoke spell that will allow us to draw 2 cards. And I'm gonna be honest, I already like including this card in any sort of creature heavy list I build, but in this type of Kasla deck the value gets even better, because whenever she is on the battlefield, this card essentially reads: pay 0 mana, tap some of your creatures, scry 2, and then draw 3, which is some pretty decent value for a spell you will be able to cast for free. Transcendent Message, a Convoke spell that will for 4 blue mana plus X draw you X cards. Now I know, 4 blue mana pips might seem really intimidating, especially since most of the tokens we generate are either red, white or colorless, and we won't be able to use them to convoke out the mana pips. But usually in practice how this goes is you can just tap your Kasla, 3 of your blue producing lands, and then you just pay the entire X cost with any of your creatures. And this is just the ultimate late game card draw spell, because once your board is established, you can just pay half of your creatures for the X cost in this spell, and you will just get to refill your entire hand, setting you up for a really solid next turn. Unexpected Assistance. For 5 mana you get to draw 3 cards and then you have to discard a card, which in this type of deck is a spell you can usually cast for 1 blue mana thanks to the Convoke mechanic. And whenever you do have Kasla on the battlefield, this effect gets even better, because it will essentially read: scry 2, draw 4, discard 1, which is some absolutely crazy value. Next up we have the support section. These are the cards that will make the deck a lot more consistent and that tie all of our strategies together, whether it's creating additional value, accelerating our mana, or allowing us to untap our creatures for even more convokes. These support cards really make the deck feel a lot smoother. Magda, Brazen Outlaw, a 2-mana creature that whenever any dwarf, including herself, becomes tapped will generate you an untapped treasure token, meaning she will generate you a treasure token whenever you are able to attack with her, and more importantly, she will even generate you treasures whenever you tap her to convoke a spell, immediately giving you access to even more mana in the form of treasure tokens, which you can use to set up these crazy Kasla Convoke storm turns. And now that we're on the topic of these explosive storm turns, Jeskai Ascendancy, a 3-mana enchantment that whenever you cast any non-creature spell will give all creatures you control a +1/+1 stat boost, and it will then also untap all of your creatures. And usually what it looks like whenever you do have a Jeskai Ascendancy and a Kasla on the battlefield, you tap all of your creatures to convoke out a spell, you will get a Kasla trigger allowing you to scry and draw, which usually will draw you into a new convoke spell. Jeskai Ascendancy will then untap all of the creatures you use to convoke the spell. You can then just tap them again to convoke out the next spell you just drew. You usually will be able to keep the chain going for like 3 or 4 spells, and at the end of the cycle your creatures will have a massive stat boost and you will be able to turn them sideways sideways and just take your opponents out of the game with them. And on top of that, this card also has a second passive effect. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you also get to loot, meaning you get to draw a card and then discard a card, allowing you to dig even deeper into your deck and increasing the odds that you will just keep drawing into convoke spells and are able to keep the chain going. Augusta, Dean of Order. Whenever we attack, we get to untap any amount of creatures we control. While this effect isn't as potent as a Jeskai Ascendancy, it is still really strong, because you can just tap all of your creatures in your first main phase to cast a big convoke spell. Since we will always have Kasla on the battlefield who we will be attacking with every single turn, we will then get to untap all of our creatures when we attack, and in our second main phase we can just tap all of them again and get out another huge convoke spell, essentially giving us double the convoke uses out of all of our creatures. And on top of that, she will also passively give all tapped creatures we control a +1 power boost and all untapped creatures a +1 toughness boost. Like I mentioned, most of our tokens will only have 1 power, and Augusta's passive ability will essentially double up on that whenever you attack with them, making your 10 power board into a 20 power board. Prosperous Partnership, a 3-mana enchantment that whenever it enters the battlefield will generate you 2 1/1 green and white citizen tokens, which will enable you to get your Kasla out on turn 4, and you can also use these tokens for its activated ability. You can tap 3 untapped creatures you control to generate you an untapped treasure token, which is an effect that will make sure none of your creature tokens ever go to waste. Because if you do have some untapped creatures left after casting a convoke spell, or you don't have any convoke spells in your hand, you can just tap all of your creatures and store mana for future turns in the form of treasure tokens. Wand of the World Soul, a 3-mana mana rock that will enter the battlefield tapped and will tap for 1 white mana. Now as a mana rock, this card is really inefficient, but the reason why it's included is its other activated ability. We can tap it to give the next spell we cast Convoke. We can use it to just cheese out any of the expensive spells in this deck that don't have the Convoke mechanic, like our Elspeth or our Porcelain Gallery, or we can even use it on our X spells like a huge Champions of Beyond or to get out a huge Jacked Rabbit. And of course, whenever we do have our Kasla on the battlefield, whenever we give Convoke to a spell, we will get to draw a card of her. Omni Changeling, a 5-mana clone creature with the Convoke mechanic, already giving us some excellent value because thanks to the Convoke mechanic we will usually be able to cast it for like 1 or 2 mana, while it will also replace itself thanks to Kasla's draw trigger. And in this deck we have many great targets to copy with this effect. Our Cosmogrant Zenith, any of our win condition creatures you will see later, or even our Enduring Innocence to start drawing a huge amount of cards. But we aren't even limited to copying our own creatures. You can even use this effect to copy your opponent's Etali, their Elesh Norn, or even their Balin and start generating you some absurd amounts of value. Pinnacle Monk, a 5-mana creature that whenever it enters the battlefield will allow you to return any instant or sorcery spell from your graveyard to your hand. And honestly, since we are playing a total of 23 instant and sorcery spells, this is just a fantastic recursion tool and you will always have targets for this effect. Now the main reason why this card is included in the deck is because whenever you don't need its effect, you can just play the backside, which is a land that even enters the battlefield untapped for the low cost of 3 life. You should view this card as a land first, that whenever you do draw into it in the late game has an additional benefit. Dazzling Theater and Prop Room, another one of the Duskmourn Room enchantment cards we're running. The left side of this card will give every creature spell you cast the Convoke keyword, meaning that we will be able to get a cost reduction on any creature in this deck that doesn't even have the Convoke mechanic by just tapping our other creatures. And every creature we do cast will now allow us to scry through and draw one of Kasla, which as you can imagine will generate you some pretty crazy card advantage. While the other side of this enchantment, Prop Room, will allow you to untap all of your creatures during each player's untap step, which does have a couple of applications in this deck. First up, it will give all of your creatures some sort of pseudo vigilance. You can just attack with them, and at the beginning of the next player's untap step, they will get untapped again and you will be able to use them as blockers. Since all of your creatures will constantly be untapped, you will get a huge amount of Convoke fuel available for any of your instant speed Convoke interaction spells that you will see later in this video. And And an effect like this also goes really insane when combined with Prosperous Partnership, because let's say you do control 9 creatures, you can just step them during your own turn to generate 3 treasures, do the same thing during opponent 1, 2 and 3's turn, and in total you will be able to generate a total of 12 treasure tokens per turn cycle, which as you can imagine is quite a nice thing to do. And we're also playing some regular mana rocks in this deck, being a Sol Ring, an Arcane Signet and 2 of the Talismans. Now obviously with all of the creature tokens we're generating and all of our Convoke spells, we don't need as many acceleration effects. That being said, during playtesting I found 1 Sol Ring and 3 regular 2 mana rocks to be perfect for this deck, allowing us to smooth out our colors, get our value engines out 1 turn earlier, while also not playing too many rocks that will be dead cards in our hand in the late game. Next up we have our win conditions. Once the deck gets going and we start generating a ton of tokens and card advantage, these are the cards that will actually allow us to close out the game. They give us ways to convert our token generation into damage, and they will allow us to turn our massive board state into an actual game win. Impact Tremors, the most straightforward win condition in the deck. It's a 2 mana enchantment that whenever any creature enters a battlefield under your control will deal 1 damage to each opponent. As you will see later in this section, we are playing a ton of cards with a similar effect. And the main reason is that dealing table-wide non-combat damage simply is way more reliable than actually going for a lethal swing with your tokens, because your opponents won't have any way to prevent the damage from Impact Tremors from happening. And it also sort of gives us double value from any of the tokens we generate, because let's say you do generate 5 tokens, Impact Tremors will then deal 5 damage to each opponent, and on a later turn you will still be able to swing with those 5 set tokens and you will get both non-combat and combat damage from them. A Gate Instigator, a card that is basically Impact Tremors on a creature body, which in this type of deck arguably makes it even better, because it gives us a body from as early as turn 2 we can use to convoke out either Kasla or any of our other convoke spells. And this cute little lizard boyo also has the Offspring mechanic, meaning that whenever we cast it and we do pay an additional 2 mana, it will enter with a 1/1 token copy of itself with exactly the same ability. And when you do Offspring it, both creatures will see each other entering and will give you 2 triggers of its effect. You will get 2 more convoke bodies on the battlefield, and every creature token you now create will deal a total of 2 damage to each opponent, which I might add does add up really quickly. Molten Gatekeeper, another 3 mana Impact Tremors on an artifact body that also has the Unearth mechanic, meaning that whenever this creature ends up in your graveyard either due to being milled or due to being removed, for just 1 red mana you can return it straight from your graveyard to the battlefield. It will then gain haste and you will have to exile it at the end of the turn, making it a really resilient tool you can just reanimate on the turn you are about to make 10 gazillion tokens and just burn down the table all at once. Warleader's Call, a 3 mana version of Impact Tremors that on top of its awesome effect will also give a +1/+1 stat boost to all of your creatures. That essentially, since we will only be generating 1/1 creature tokens, will just double the stats of all tokens we control, both speeding up the clock our opponents are on by adding an additional Impact Tremors effect, while also doubling the amount of combat damage output we have. And fun fact, it will also increase the damage output of Kasla by 1. So now instead of having to connect with your Kasla 5 times to an opponent to take them out on commander damage, you can now do so in just 4 hits. Purphoros, God of the Forge, a massive 4 mana indestructible enchantment creature that, just like all of the other Taros gods, will only be a creature on the battlefield once your devotion to red hits 5 or more, meaning you have to have permanents on the battlefield that have at least 5 red mana pips in their costs. Now, no matter if you do meet the devotion requirements and Purphoros is an enchantment or a creature, you will always have his 2 abilities active. His first ability being a passive effect that is essentially a beefed up version of an Impact Tremors, because now whenever any creature enters the battlefield under your control, it will deal 2 damage to each opponent. Yeah, if you now are able to generate 10 creature tokens, which mind you is something really easy to do in this deck, you will now get to chunk your opponents for half of their life totals. And on top top of that, Pugfuros also has an activated ability. For 3 mana, you can give all your creatures fire breathing, meaning they will get +1 power until the end of turn. Now, while most decks run Pugfuros for his Impact Tremors effect, in some late game situations his activated ability might actually make the difference. Because if you do have 10 creature tokens on the battlefield, every time you now invest 3 mana into his ability, you will get to deal an additional 10 damage, which is pretty awesome. And since Pugfuros is quite an expensive card, we got quite a nice budget alternative for him in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle set / Reptile Rampager, which has exactly the same passive effect that will deal 2 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters, and whenever you attack with / he even generates his own 2/2 creature token, triggering his passive effect. It will cost you 1 mana more, and it will be way easier to deal with due to not having the indestructible keyword, but if you are on a budget, it is quite a nice alternative. Virtue of Loyalty, a 2 mana instant speed spell that will generate you a 2/2 night token with vigilance that you can use really early into the game to get a convoke body and a creature token out, and on a later turn for 5 mana you can cast this as an enchantment that at the beginning of your end step will untap all of your creatures and will put a +1/+1 counter on all of them. An effect that, just like Prop Room, will give all of your creatures pseudo vigilance, will enable you to tap them again to convoke out any instant speed spell, scales incredibly well with Prosperous Partnership, and thanks to its counter stacking will eventually win you the game if your opponents have no way to deal with this enchantment. City on Fire, a massive 8 mana enchantment with the convoke mechanic, meaning we will usually be able to get this out as early as turn 5, while also giving us a Kasla trigger in the process. And whenever this massive enchantment is on the battlefield and a source we control would deal damage to a permanent or a player, it will deal triple that amount of damage instead. And I can guarantee you, once this enchantment is on the field, the game will be over rather quickly. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Any creature entering with an Impact Tremors on the battlefield will now deal 3 damage to all of your opponents. Whenever you now tap an elemental from Wildfire Awakener, you will get a free lightning bolt at any opponent. All creature tokens that now connect in combat with 1 power will now deal 3 damage instead. Instead of just dealing the 5 normal damage, Kasla will now deal 15 commander damage when she connects. And whenever you now create a couple of tokens with a Pugfuros on the battlefield, you will get to deal a total of 6 stable-wide damage per token you create. Yeah, if your opponents can deal with this card, the game will be over in like 1 or 2 turns. And the last card in this section is a Fated Firepower. For 3 red mana plus X, you get an enchantment that will enter the battlefield with X fire counters on it. And just like the previous card, if any source you control would deal damage to a permanent or a player, it will deal that much damage +1 for each fire counter on this enchantment. And thanks to most of our damage being dealt in really small instances of 1 damage, just casting this card for 4 mana with 1 fire counter on it will essentially double all of the damage output we have in the deck. All of our Impact Tremor effects, the damage of the tokens from Wildfire Awakener, and all of the damage that our tokens will deal in combat. And obviously, once you are able to cast this in the late game and make it enter with like 3, 4, 5 fire counters on it, any instance of 1 damage you deal will be increased by a huge amount, and you will usually be able to win the game on the spot. And my favorite part about this card is the fact that it has the flash mechanic, meaning you can cast it on instant speed whenever you are about to deal a huge amount of damage, and you will be able to totally catch your opponents off guard with this effect. Next up, we have the Protection and the Interaction. These are the cards that will help us protect our own board and value pieces, and help us disrupt our opponent's game plans. Paw to Exile and Swords to Plowshares. Both are 1 mana instant speed spells that allow us to exile any creature on the battlefield on instant speed. If you're in white, there's really no reason to not include these cards in your deck. They are simply some of the most efficient removal spells ever printed. While they won't be advancing our own game plan, they do give us a way to deal with whatever our opponents are doing. An offer you can't refuse. For 1 blue mana, we get to counter target non-creature spell. In return, the controller of that spell will get to generate 2 treasure tokens. Now, as you can imagine, with all of our value creatures and the tokens we'll be generating, the absolute worst nightmare of this type of deck is board wipe. wipes. And just the fact that we can stop those from happening for just 1 blue mana and giving out some measly treasure tokens is always going to be a really good deal. Boros Charm. For 2 mana on instant speed, we get to pick 1 out of 3 fantastic options. The first option allows us to deal 4 damage to any target player, which I suppose in 1% of games might actually help you get those last points of damage in. The second option will give all permanents you control indestructible until the end of turn, which is just the perfect answer against any sort of board wipe or spot removal spell targeted at your value creatures. And the last option will allow you to give target creature double strike until the end of turn. A really nice effect to use on your Kasla, which might help you get to that 21 commander damage. Downstruce. For 2 mana you get to give both yourself and all permanents you control hexproof until the end of turn. And whenever you cast a spell, you also get the option to gift a card, meaning one of your opponents will get to draw 1 card. When you do, all permanents you control will also get indestructible, making it into one of the best answers against board wipes or spot removal that we have available to us. Ephemeral Shields. A 2 mana spell that will give target creature indestructible until the end of turn. And the best part about this card is that it also has the Convoke mechanic, meaning it will act as a cantrip whenever we do have Kasla on the battlefield, and we can just tap all of our lands, pass the turn to our opponent, and for as long as we do control 2 untapped creatures, we will still be able to cast a protection spell. Grand Crescendo. For 2 white mana plus X, we get to generate X/1/1 green and white citizen tokens, making it function in exactly the same way as a Secure the Wastes. But on top of that, after you generated those tokens, all creatures you control will also get indestructible until the end of turn. You can both use it as an X spell instant speed token generator, you can use it as protection from any sort of board wipe, and when you do have the mana available, you can use it as a protection tool that will also generate you tokens you can use on a later turn. Will of the Mardu. A 3 mana instant that will allow you to pick 1 out of 2 options. The first option will allow you to generate X/1/1 red warrior tokens equal to the amount of creatures target player does control, which usually will function in a way to just double up on the amount of creatures you control, going from 5 tokens to 10, or from 10 tokens to 20, and the second option will deal damage to target creature equal to the amount of creatures you do control, making it function as an excellent spot removal tool, especially due to the sheer amount of creatures we will always have on the battlefield. And the best part about this card is that whenever you cast a spell with your commander on the battlefield, you get to pick both options at once. First generating you the tokens, and then allowing you to remove a creature on the board. And now we're gonna get into some protection and interaction spells that have the Convoke mechanic and will give us Kasla triggers whenever we cast them. Stoke the Flames. For 4 mana on instant speed, we get to deal 4 damage to any target. Nowadays, most people are playing low-cost value commanders like an Ishtola or a Balin, and 4 damage will usually be more than enough to get those creatures off the board. While in most decks this spell isn't really that efficient, just keep in mind that in this deck we can use the massive amount of creatures we have on the board to pay for the mana cost, and that this card will essentially replace itself whenever we do have Kasla on the battlefield. Conclave Tribunal, a card that is basically the Convoke version of an Oblivion Ring. Whenever this enchantment enters the battlefield, we get to pick 1 non-land permanent on the board, we get to exile it, and it will stay in exile for as long as this enchantment remains on the battlefield, allowing you to deal with creatures, enchantments, artifacts, or even planeswalkers. Temporal Cleansing. For 4 mana we get to pick any non-land permanent on the battlefield, and the owner of that permanent will have to put it in their library second from top or on the bottom. And this type of effect will allow you to bypass any sort of death triggers, it will bypass indestructibility, and this type of effect is also fantastic against reanimation players, because the card will just go back to their deck and not their graveyard, so they won't be able to reanimate it again. Clever Concealment. Whenever you cast a spell, you can pick any number of non-land permanents you control and they will phase out, meaning they won't exist until your next turn. And this card even allows you to bypass some things that a Downstruce can't handle, like a Farewell on Creatures, a Cyclonic Rift, or even a Summon Leviathan. And thanks to this card having the the Convoke mechanic, you can just step out, leave 4 of your creatures untapped, and you will have one of the best protection spells in the entire game still available to you while your opponents think you don't have the mana for it. Disruptor of Currents, a 5 mana flash Convoke body that whenever it enters the battlefield will allow you to bounce up to 1 non-land permanent on the battlefield, giving you a way to bounce your own value permanents to your hand if they are being targeted by spot removal, or if any of your opponents just did a huge amount of effort to get their Nicol Bolas flipped, you can just bounce it back to their hand and the problem is dealt with. The Wandering Rescuer, a 5 mana flash Convoke double strike body that will give all other tapped creatures you control hexproof. And this mix of keywords combined with this ability makes for a really cool synergy. Because let's say you're just doing your thing and you have your untapped Kasla on the battlefield because she doesn't get tapped whenever you attack with her, and an opponent is trying to cast a Path to Exile on her. In response, you can then cast your Wandering Rescuer and tap your Kasla to help pay for the mana cost. This creature will then enter. Since Kasla is tapped, she will now get hexproof and the spot removal spell will fizzle. And for as long as this card is on the battlefield, you can use any sort of instant speed Convoke spell to just tap your creatures whenever you want, give them hexproof, and they will essentially be untargetable by spot removal or abilities. Artistic Refusal. For 6 mana you get a Convoke spell that will allow you to choose one or both of its options. The first option will just straight up allow you to counter any spell on the stack, and the second option will allow you to draw 2 cards and then discard a card. And since we will usually be able to cast this for like 1 or 2 mana by convoking it, whenever we then have Kasla on the field, this card essentially reads scry 2, draw 3, discard 1, counter target spell. Yeah, Kasla turns all of these Convoke spells into some absolutely insane value pieces. Calamity of Cinders. For 7 mana you get a spell that will deal 6 damage to each untapped creature. And thanks to this card having the Convoke mechanic, we can just tap our own creatures to help pay for the mana cost, and since they then will be tapped, they will be unaffected by the massive amount of damage this spell will deal, making it act as a one-sided board wipe that will even replace itself whenever you do cast it with Kasla on the battlefield. And the last card in this section is an Everything Comes to Dust, a massive 10 mana Convoke spell that will exile all creatures on the battlefield except for those that share a creature type with whatever creature that helped convoke this spell, and it will also exile all artifacts and enchantments. Now, just like the previous card, you can just tap down your entire board to pay for the mana cost of this spell, and everything that didn't share a type with whatever you tapped will just permanently be exiled, which in most cases will be about 90% of the board, making this card into a one-sided farewell effect. But please, just do keep in mind whenever you do have an Omni Changeling on the battlefield, don't use it to convoke this spell, because it will have all creature types and no other creatures will be exiled. And last up we have the lands. I did try to make this deck as budget friendly as possible, and you can certainly upgrade it by using things like the fetch lands, the bond lands, a mana confluence, or you can also choose to make the deck a little cheaper by replacing some of the more expensive lands by things like the scry lands. We're also running a couple of utility lands, so I'll start by going over those. Kavaron, Memorial World, the red planet card we got in the Edge of Eternity set. This card has the station mechanic, meaning on sorcery speed we can tap any amount of creatures we control to add charge counters onto this card equal to the tapped creature's power. And once this land reaches 12 charge counters, it will get access to its activated ability, which for 2 mana, sacrificing a land and tapping it will generate us a 2/2 artifact robot token. And then all creatures we control will get +1 power and haste until the end of turn. Now Kavaron is included for a couple of reasons. First up, it gives us a really nice outlet with the station ability to tap our Remcarolus and our Magda to generate us either treasure tokens or creature tokens. And the second reason is that later in the game it is a fantastic haste enabler that will also double the damage output that all of our 1 power creature tokens are gonna be dealing. Minas Tirith, a land that will enter the battlefield untapped if you do control a legendary creature, and for 2 mana and tapping this land we get to draw a card. but we can only activate this ability if we did attack with 2 or more creatures this turn. And this requirement is really easy to meet in this deck, because you will be swinging every single turn with your Kasla, and then you can easily throw just 1 additional creature token into the mix, which will enable an additional card draw option on something as simple as a land. Sokenzan, Crucible of Defiance, a legendary land that doesn't even enter the battlefield tapped, so there are no real downsides to including this, and it also has the channel ability, meaning whenever this card is in your hand you can pay 4 mana and discard it to generate you 2 1/1 spirit tokens with haste, and the cost of the channel ability will be reduced by 1 generic mana for each legendary creature you control. A land that functions as a basic mountain that whenever you draw into it later in the game will generate you creature bodies to trigger any of your impact tremor effects, or that can be used as fuel for your convoking. And for the regular mana producing lands we're playing 3 of the shock lands, 3 check lands, 3 pain lands, 3 of the slow lands, 3 fast lands, 2 filter lands, 2 horizon lands, a command tower, a tapped tri-land, and for basics we're playing 4 plains, 3 mountains, and 2 islands. And that's it for my in-depth Kasla the Broken Halo deck tech. A commander that turns creature tokens into mana, convoke spells into pure card advantage, and that will snowball out of control once the engine gets going. Instead of using combos, this deck really rewards you for building a board full of creatures and sequencing your convoke spells correctly. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, let me know by dropping an angel emoji in the comments below. Share this video with everyone in your playgroup, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon so you won't miss next week's video. Thanks for watching, enjoy swarming the board with your tokens, and I'll see you in the next one.